Romans 11, verse by verse, line by line. That is going to be our agenda here today. This is the A.K. Richardson podcast. Thanks for watching. We are on live. And of course, afterwards, you can listen to this on podcast audio on different podcast platforms. If you want to watch us live, when we go live, go to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/AK Richardson, and you'll be notified. Just subscribe, and you'll be notified when we go live. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, I ask that you do so. It helps us out here. So, Romans 11. Now, if you've been following the channel, you know that for some time now I've been talking about Israel, been talking about these issues. So what we're going to do is go through Romans chapter 11. Now, the most popular theology in America within Christendom here today is, of course, the idea that God's chosen people are Israel, the nation of Israel, and that God is going to restore the nation of Israel to salvation at some point in our future. And a lot of people see it as going to be happening sometime soon. Okay, so that is the most popular theology. We call that dispensationalism, if you don't know what the name is. And Romans 11 is the most significant passage in the New Testament when it comes to this idea, because this is the main passage that people think tells us, predicts, tells us that Israel, the nation, is going to be saved in the future. Particularly the verse that says, and so all Israel will be saved. Now, so we're going to take some time here, well over an hour, I'm sure, to go through this. I want to thoroughly follow the chapter, because I do not believe popular ideas, the ones I just told you about, is taught in Romans 11. I do not believe, and friends, I'm just going to be honest with you. I think if you watch and if you follow along here, you're going to see this quite clearly, that Romans 11 does not predict any such thing with Israel, and in fact does not teach that the nation of Israel is the chosen people of God. So you don't have to agree, but I hope that you will follow along with an open mind. Now, if you don't have the kind of time, if you say, okay, well, listen, I don't have this kind of time to follow along, well, I recommend another video on my channel. It's called Romans 11 in 20 minutes. As a matter of fact, what we're doing here right now is based upon the presentation that I have in that video. It's basically using that as the bones, and we're going to fill it in with meat and organs, and we're going to be thorough here. Okay, Romans 11. Now, you know Romans 11, it talks about God not rejecting His people. It talks about, as I said earlier, and so all Israel will be saved. Those things are found in this particular passage, and we're going to look at it. So, if you are somebody who believes, yes, God is going to restore the nation of Israel once again in the future. If you're someone who believes that this is a passage that teaches that, if you're someone who says, now that has to be true, because God is not going to go back on His promises. Well, this is the passage. This is going to be the study for you. Of course, nobody believes God goes back on His promises. And if you believe something like, well, God hasn't rejected His people permanently, this is exactly the study for you. So I think you'll find this enlightening. Okay, so now, as you may or may not know, if you don't know, Romans 11, of course, is a part of a 3-chapter discourse in the book of Romans. Romans 9, 10, and 11 are a unit. Now, of course, not to say something completely different from the rest of the book, but actually, and let's just do this. Let's go to, here I am going to pull up Romans 3, because actually, as Paul is talking about how the Jews are not superior to Gentiles because all have sinned and all need to be justified through grace, in faith, or through faith, by grace, I should say, through faith in Christ, that everybody has sinned, everybody's condemned, nobody by their works is going to be justified, all need the grace that is found in Christ. So he's making that case, and along the way he brings up certain objections that no doubt he has heard, but he just doesn't get off into them. One of them happens, actually a few of them happen here in chapter 3, but one very particular So in Romans chapter 1 and 2, he talks about how the Jews are no different. They are sinners just like Gentiles, and therefore need justification some other way than their own personal righteousness. He makes that case. Okay, so then in chapter 3, verse 1, he says, then what advantage has the Jew? If this is the case, Paul, so they're no better, they have no advantage at all, right? They had nothing that was an advantage or benefit to them as a covenant people, as the Jewish people. And he says, or what is the value of circumcision, being Jewish? He says, great in every respect. First of all, that they were entrusted with the oracles of God. In other words, hey, these people had God's revelation. We call it the Old Testament. They would call it the Tanakh. They had God's revelation. They had their prophets. They had Moses throughout all of their history. They had a great advantage. They had much more advantage than the Gentiles. Okay. But then he says, what then if some, here's the key, here's the objection that he raises right here. I'll take note. If some did not believe, that is, some Jews did not believe, does their unbelief abolish the faithfulness of God? So God had made promises to this covenant people. And he says, well, what if, so this is no doubt objections that he has heard. He says, if some of the Jews, well, they didn't believe, they weren't faithful, does that mean God is just going to forget about his promises, that he's not going to be faithful also? And Paul says, may it never be. Rather, let God be true and every man a liar. But he doesn't elaborate on that particular objection other than to say such like things are blasphemy, basically. But here's the thing. Paul is going to return to this leftover objection in Romans chapter 9. So he makes the case for what he wants to say, and then when he's done, basically with the main point, he's got these objections that he needs to return to before he gets to the matters of practicality in the latter chapters. You know, in the first few verses of Romans chapter 9, he talks about his love for his Jewish family, for the Jews, according to blood. If he says, if he could, he would have himself accursed. If it would save them, of course it won't. So the problem is that most of the nation had rejected Christ and was not saved, despite the fact that they were Jews, right? That was his concern. And then he is going to return to the issue that he raised in chapter 3, but now he's going to spend time on it. And this is key, because Romans 11 is the concluding part of a 3-chapter discourse. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of people go to the end of chapter 11 when it says, and so all Israel shall be saved. A blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. They go to those verses to say, you see, God's going to save the nation of Israel in the future, without realizing that there's a whole discourse before this that is determining what Paul means when he says those words. And if you just go to that verse and you've heard popular theology, you're not really going to know what Paul is actually saying when he says those things. But we are here because we're going to go through Romans 11. We're going to very briefly look at Romans 9 and 10 leading up to it. And so, we talked about the first few verses of chapter 9, and that Paul had a concern for his Jewish family because the nation in large was not saved. He talked about certain benefits the Jews had. These benefits were primarily historical, things that they had had in their history, but they were still unsaved. So now Paul returns to the issue. And maybe pull it up here. Make sure here. Restart this. Okay. So my slides are not pulling up for some reason. Let me try something different here. All right, so I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I am going to okay. So we seem to be at the very end. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to backtrack through all this. For some whatever reason, it ain't really working. Okay. So, there we go. All right, so Romans 9, sorry about that. So here we get into it. Verse 6, but it is not as though the word of God has failed. Okay, that's what he said in Romans chapter 3. He says, what if some do not believe? Will this nullify the faithfulness of God? So in other words, the word of God, his promises to Israel, he's saying, does that mean nothing? And he's saying, it is not as though God has been unfaithful to his promises. So what's the issue? The issue is God promised to save Israel, but the nation of Israel is mostly lost. Seems like a problem, right? How does that relate to God's promises? What about God's promises? Paul says, but God's promises have not failed. How so? And that, how so, is these 3 chapters. Now I want you to marinate on that because that's going to determine everything that he says. How is it that though God promised to save Israel, the nation of Israel was mostly lost in Paul's time, and yet God hasn't broken his promises? How is that? Well, that is the key. Now I'm going to adjust my lights here. So if you understand that, you understand the most important thing to following Paul's train of thought. So, how is it that God's promises had been kept, have not failed, despite the nation being lost? Well, he's going to tell us right here in chapter 9, verse 6. He says, for they are not all Israel who are of Israel. What does that mean? They are not all Israel who are of Israel. Well, that is pretty significant. You know what that means? It means there's 2 Israels. That's the first thing to understand. There are 2 Israels. I mean, think about it. As he says, they are not all Israel who are of Israel. You see, in the New Testament, this is found all throughout the New Testament, and in particular in these chapters, there's 2 Israels. One is spiritual, one is physical. Okay? Not all of the ethnic people that we call Israel are Israel. What does it have to do with his promises? Well, God promised to save Israel. So the idea is clear from the beginning of the chapter here, which is the Israel that God intended by his promise is not all the ethnic people. That's what popular theology does not understand. Everybody keeps wanting to say the nation of Israel, that's God's people. No, it isn't, friends. Paul says, no, not all the ethnic people are the Israel intended by the promise. There's a Israel within the group. What does that mean? Who is that Israel in the group? Well, he says, nor are they all children because they are Abraham's seed. In other words, just because they are the descendants of Abraham doesn't mean they're the children. What does that mean? Well, the next verse tells us he means the children of God. That's who the people of God is, or are, I should say. The children of God are his people. Well, so when people say the nation of Israel is his people, no. Paul says no, it's not the ethnic people. They're not all children of God just because of their physical descent, just because of their ethnicity. Popular theology says exactly that. Popular theology is wrong. So then who are they? What are we to make of it? He says, that is, the children of the flesh are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are considered as seed, the seed of Abraham. Now, if you go to Galatians chapter 3, now, we may just, in fact, well, I'll tell you what. I have videos on these kinds of things, but if you go to Galatians chapter 3 and chapter 4, you're going to see that the same thing is talked about in those 2 chapters. Actually, it's the whole book. In fact, Galatians has been called a mini Romans, a miniature Romans, because it's kind of the same thing, only condensed. Listen, we might as well go there, even though my slides weren't working when I came back. So in Galatians, we're going to be quick about this when we get to chapter 11, but this is very important, though. So we'll start here. It says, know that those who are of faith, those are the sons of Abraham. And this includes Gentiles. I mean, look what he says. And the scriptures foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, proclaim the gospel beforehand to Abraham. Then those, in verse 9, so then those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham the believer. And it just says, those are the sons of Abraham. Well, in Romans chapter 9, we just said it's the children of promise that are counted as seed. It's not the ethnic nation of Israel, it's believers. Now, the Israel within Israel in Romans chapter 9, Paul's focus is on true Jewish people. They are believers from Israel, not the ethnic people. Believers is just another way of saying Christians. And he says, let's see, verse 16, now the promises, that's the promises made to Israel, were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. Now, Romans 9, it says, children of promise are counted as seed. And who's he talking about? The real Israel in chapter 9. We know that, we just saw. He does not say to seeds as referring to many, but rather to one, and to your seed. That is Christ. Christ is Israel, spiritually speaking. Now, it goes on at the end to say, but now that faith has come in verse 25, we are no longer under a tutor, but you are all sons of God, children of God, as in Romans 9, through faith. Now, he's talking to a Gentile Christian audience. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. You've taken his identity. There is neither Jew nor Greek. Well, that means popular theology can't be true because you have to distinguish one people of God by their ethnicity as opposed to the other people of God, the church. Popular theology separates two peoples of God, Israel and then the church. No, because then you have to use ethnicity, but in Christ there is no ethnicity. Notice verse 29, if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to promise. Well, Romans 9 just said that the children of God is not the children of the flesh, but the children of promise are counted as seed. That's exactly what it's talking about in Galatians. In Galatians, it's talking about Gentile Christians. Of course, it would include all Christians, regardless of your ethnicity. Now, one more, and in Galatians 4, you notice how in Romans 9 it said, neither are they, we talked about Isaac, and he said, actually, did I read that part in Romans 9? Let's go back and see. He says, but through Isaac, in Romans 9, verse 7, your seed will be named. Those will be the ones counted as the children of promise. The children of God are the ones, and he uses Isaac as an example from their history here. Well, that's exactly what he's going to say in Galatians chapter 4. He says, and you brothers, this is Galatians 4:28, talking to a Gentile Christian church. He says, and you brothers, in accordance with Isaac, same thing he said in Romans 9, are children of promise. But that's interesting because when popular theology people, when people who believe dispensationalism and the common things that we hear about Israel, when they go to Romans 9, they say, no, this is just talking about Jewish people. True Jews are Jews that are believers. That's all it is saying, AK. No, it's saying the same thing. He says in Galatians 3 and 4, but it includes Gentile Christians as well. Now, there is going to be an emphasis on the Christians from the ethnic nation. But he is making the point clear as well that this includes Gentile Christians. So the true Israel, so if we go back, this true Israel that was intended by the promises is not the ethnic nation, but believers from Israel. And we're going to see, as he's about to say, also in Galatians 3 and 4, that this includes Gentile Christians. You know who the true Israel is? The one that the promise was intending? It's the church. The church of the Lord Jesus Christ. The church just means an assembly of people. That's all the word means. It is the people that belong to Christ. Of course, that is the true Israel. Okay, so in Romans, let's see here. Yeah, the children of promise. Okay, now he goes on in chapter 9, verse 24. Actually, in verse 23, he's talking about the vessels of mercy from the nation of Israel. And then he says in 24, even us whom he also called. Not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. Now notice that's what he says, from the Gentiles. I'm just going to adjust my lights again. My people from among the Gentiles. And then he says, as he says in Hosea, I will call those who were not my people, and her who was not my beloved. You see how that includes Gentiles? But what is he talking about? Remember, the beginning of chapter 9 began by talking about the Israel intended by the promise. And it's not the nation of Israel, but the Israel within Israel, which include believers. But the children of promise are not merely ethnic, so it includes Gentiles. It's Christians. That's God's true Israel. It is Christians. There isn't any doubt about it. Each day, every day, all day, it is Christians. That's God's true Israel. And you can see this taught all throughout the New Testament. Go see my discussion with Chris Dade on this very issue, that the church is the true Israel. You can find it on my channel. Okay, so we got key point here, number 2. Believing Jews and Gentiles are explicitly said in the context to be God's people. Everybody says, well, no, it's the nation of Israel is God's people that he's talking about. No, it's not. It is believing Jews and Gentiles. Christians are God's people. He says that right there. We just read it. So when you get to Romans 11, you've already defined in the context, Paul has already defined who God's true Israel is. That's what everybody misses when they just go to Romans 9 and so all Israel will be saved. You don't even know what Paul's talking about. Okay. And then he says, now, you could see my other video that's in 20 minutes. It's called Romans 11 in 20 minutes. And you can see that actually when you go to Hosea, God is actually talking about how Israel had been cast off in punishment and he was going to gather his people back. Gather Israel back. You know, everybody's looking for the restoration of Israel. Oh, it happened. Because Paul applies it to the Christians. He has restored Israel. We call it the church. It was actually called the church too, even in the Old Testament Israel. But I haven't been looking at my side chat. I appreciate you guys. I just want to say that as we keep moving along. Brian, Melody, Beautiful Berserk. I see you guys there. Occasionally, if I can think about it, I might look to the side chat for questions as we move along, as long as they're on exactly what we're talking about. We'll do our best we can. Okay, just put at AK or something like that so I know, but I can't make any promises. Okay, but nevertheless. And then he goes on in Isaiah chapter 20, Romans 9:27 to say, and Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel be like the sand of the sea, it is the remnant that shall be saved. Okay. So what we have is key point number 3. Only a remnant of Israel will be saved. You're never going to find Paul saying the nation of Israel in large or as a mass of people is going to be saved at some point in the future. That's not what it's about. It's about when it comes to actual Jewish people, as opposed to Gentiles, you're only going to get a remnant of the nation. You're only going to get a remnant of ethnic Israel. It's not the nation that's going to be saved. Now, he's been making the point that Gentiles and Jews, as believers, are God's true Israel. They are his people. We Christians, friends, we Christians are God's Israel. We are his people. That is clearly defined. But here he's making the point that when it comes to actual ethnic people, only a remnant of them will be saved. And they, of course, are included in and as Christians. Not the nation, not a mass of Jews, a remnant. That's what Paul tells us. I mean, we haven't even got out of Romans 9, let alone the Romans 11, and we have already seen that popular theology has fallen apart. Okay. Now, Romans 10 is not usually too disputed, so I'm going to save time by not going through it. But he talks about how, as far as the Jews are concerned, they thought, well, they had their law, but when it comes to salvation, it's real close to everybody, Jew and Gentile. It is the gospel. And he says, and all the Jews have heard, in the known world, the gospel had been spread, and they, by and large, had rejected it. And did Israel, in Romans 10, he says, did Israel not know about the Gentiles coming? And sure they knew. So once again, he returns to the idea at the end of chapter 10, because he hasn't left the subject, that Gentiles were coming in as God's people, and the Jews knew of this all along from prophecies in their own scripture. You see, because the restoration of Israel is happening in Christianity, not the nation of Israel. Now, by the way, I got to say, I wish that all Jews would be saved. I got nothing against them. You won't find me, well, I mean, I'm going to go off on a point probably that'll get us down a rabbit trail. So let me just say, I wish that all Jews, I wish that everybody was saved. I think we should be evangelizing Jews. But Romans 11 does not predict a future salvation of that nation. But we must proceed. Okay, so then we get right to now Romans chapter 11. Now we've gone a long way. We're not even in the chapter yet. And already popular theology just doesn't hold up. And you're going to see that that is especially the case in Romans chapter 11. Okay, think about it. And here's a good question right while we're at it. To be clear, the restoration of Israel is accomplished by the person and work of Christ in his two comings. Agreed. Yeah, well, his first coming, he established his new covenant. The restoration of Israel was worked out in the first century by the establishment of Christianity in the kingdom of Christ. And on throughout the ages, as Jews and Gentiles are brought into the kingdom, this is Israel. When Christ comes again, he will demolish all rebellion and enemies, and then all you will have is his glorious kingdom. Okay, so Romans 11, verse 1. I say then, has God rejected his people? May it never be. For I too am an Israelite, a seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Or do you not know what the scriptures say in the passage about Elijah? How he appeals to God against Israel. All right. Notice this, and this is going to be key. Actually, everything we've talked about is key. This is going to be like a nail in the coffin for popular theology. And by the way, it's not because I don't like popular theology, and it's not to be hostile. It's just because I care about being correct. Paul says God has not rejected his people. You think about that for a second. Paul says, God, verse 2 here, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. But what does modern popular theology say? Dispensationalism, in other words. Well, we know what they say, but here's key point number 4. God has not now rejected his people. I say now, I'm talking about Paul's time, 2,000 years ago. Paul said back then that God had not rejected his people. Now my question again, what does popular theology say? What does dispensationalism say? You know what it says? It says God has in fact rejected his people. It says exactly the opposite of what Paul says. Now that's interesting. Don't you think that's interesting? Paul says God has not rejected his people. The problem is dispensationalism, popular theology today, they believe God's people, as we have already seen, is erroneous, but they believe God's people is the nation of Israel. That's where they went off the track when it came to accuracy. And that's why they get into this problem. Because if you believe that God's people is the nation of Israel, then you have to concede God has, at least for now, or at least in part, has in fact cast away his people. But Paul says he hasn't. Now, if you look at dispensationalists and those who teach that theology today, like the famous Left Behind ideas and the books and the movies, or dispensationalists today. Now, Dallas Theological Seminary, I mean, they put out dispensationalism right and left, or dispensationalist, and that doesn't mean nothing good comes from that educational system. It just means it is rooted in dispensationalism. Every one of these men and this system and all the other people out there who teach this, they say, you're going to hear this. You're going to hear them say one of two things. And they mean the same thing, but they'll say it one of two ways. They're going to say, now when you come to Romans 11, friends, Paul tells us that God has not cast away his people permanently. I hear it all the time. That God has not cast away his people permanently. Now, where did Paul say permanently in the text? He wasn't talking about those kinds of qualifiers. Well, here's the problem. If you're going to say, and they do in fact say, that God has not cast away his people permanently, what you are conceding to is that he has cast them away temporarily. Which is just to say he has cast them away. But what does Paul say? He has not. Here's the other thing that our dispensationalist friends are going to say, and I mean the same thing. They're going to say God has not cast away his people in total. I hear them say that quite often. Which is to say the same thing. He hasn't cast them off in total means he has cast them off in part. But what does Paul say? He says, God has not cast away his people. Now, I recently did a debate with a guy. His name is Dr. George Antonios. In the cross-examination, I kept asking him, well, if you believe God has not cast them off permanently, then you do mean he has cast them off. Temporarily, but he has cast them off. And he said, well, yes, sure, but well, then you contradict Paul. You see, that's the problem. Dispensationalism, which is modern theology's most popular version within Christianity in America, and it's found around the world. But it says, because they think that the nation of Israel is God's people, they have to believe, well, there has been a casting away of his people, but it isn't permanent. But the reason Paul never says that is because God hasn't cast away his people at all, even for a little bit, because as we have already seen, friends, and if you're a dispensationalist, you saw it just a little bit ago, because God's people is not the nation of Israel, it is Christians. It is believing Jew and Gentile. It's the church. Those are God's people. We were told that by Paul in chapter 9, which is the beginning of this discourse. So modern popular theology, dispensationalism, is wrong. You know, if you're a dispensationalist, I love you. But you're wrong. Okay, Jack Hibbs, very wrong. John MacArthur, wrong. Ted Cruz, wrong. Of course, he's not a theologian. He's still wrong. Left Behind series, wrong. Mike Winger, some of you know him, wrong. Chris Date, well, he's not exactly a dispensationalist, but he's got similar ideas, wrong. Robert Jeffress, or Jeffers, or whatever his name is, wrong. Okay. Now, I let's look at something else. Now, I didn't highlight it here, actually. So before we get to these verse 3, 4, and 5, which I got highlighted, ignore the highlighting. I have something else to say about verses 1 and 2, because this is the other thing that people misunderstand. So in verse 1 and 2, Paul says, I too am an Israelite, a seed of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin. Why does Paul say that? Because, now this is actually very easy to understand. The reason Paul says that is because he is proof that God has not currently cast away his people. Because his people from the nation of Israel, he has already told us, is the remnant. The people from the Jewish ethnic nation that are going to be saved is a remnant of people. And that is Christians. So Paul has told us that God's true people are believers, that God's true people from the nation of Israel is a remnant of believers, and he's saying, I'm one of those. Paul's saying, look at me. So what he's saying is, God has not broke his promises. Remember, that's how chapter 9 started. That's the point. Remember, all of this is to say how God has kept his promises, despite the fact that the nation of Israel is unsaved and in unbelief. And Paul is saying, because the promise is to save his people Israel is not the ethnic nation, it is believers from the nation of Israel. And he's saying, I'm one of them. You see, God has not cast away his people from Israel, the nation of Israel, because here I am. I'm a Christian. His people are Christians. But dispensationalists, I mean, they miss his point entirely. They think he's saying something like, well, you see, because God is saving me, a Jewish person, this is proof, don't you know, that he's going to save the nation of Israel at some point in the future? Yeah, he doesn't say that. Paul never says that he's going to save the nation of Israel in the future. Oh, but what about verse later when he says, and so all Israel shall be saved? Oh, yes, but we haven't got there yet. Remember, that's the conclusion from everything else he's already been saying. But people, I mean, even just today, I saw a comment responding to these kinds of things I'm saying, and he was saying, you totally missed it, AK. Paul himself says that he's a Jewish person. I was listening to Mike Winger. He's a popular guy on the internet. He was saying, well, it's kind of obvious that God's people is the nation of Israel. I mean, that's what Paul is saying. No, Paul's saying that his people from the ethnic people is and are Christians. And that's what he's saying he is. You know, Mike Winger read it and say, well, it's kind of, he says it, his people, he says, he's talking about Jews, and he says, has God cast away his people? Mike says, well, he says it right there, they're his people. No, Mike, he already told us in the beginning that his people is not the ethnic people, but Christians. That's why God's promises haven't failed, because his promises to save Israel referred to the spiritual Israel, the true Israel, which consists of Jews and Gentiles. It's not a new entity. It's that Gentiles have been brought into it. We're going to see that here in just a little bit. But everybody wants to say, well, because Paul's a Jew, he's saying God will save the Jews in the future. No, that doesn't follow. Just because he saves Paul, a Jew, 2,000 years ago, that doesn't tell us that he's going to save Jews in the future. What it would tell us that God will save believers. That's what it'll tell us, and that's exactly Paul's point. Okay, now verse 3, 4, and 5 is an example from the Old Testament history of Israel with exactly the same idea. It's about a remnant of believers when the whole nation, or the nation at large, is rebellious against God. Had to do with Elisha. Elisha and 7,000 other Jews were a remnant of faithful people from the ethnic Israel. God has always had, God's true people have always been a remnant within the nation. And God's promises to save Israel never applied to the ethnic nation at large. Okay. Someone's making a point about a new entity. Yeah, so we're going to talk more about that when we get to the olive tree, which is not too far away. Okay, and so referring to his example from Elijah, he said, because there was a remnant of people even in that day, and he says in verse 5, in this way then, at the present time, a remnant, according to God's gracious choice, has also come to be. A remnant, a portion, a smaller portion of ethnic Israel is the believers. And Paul's saying at this present time. Now, that is a marker for us. We have a time marker. And what is it? Present time. You see, everybody thinks the chapter is focusing on a distant future event, the salvation of Israel. No, not at all. Paul is actually focusing on things that were already happening in his present time. He says, at this present time, there's a remnant. In verses 1 and 2, he said God had not rejected his people in Paul's day. Now, this would continue to be true and continues to be true to our day. But my point is that Paul was not talking about future events. He was talking about present realities that continued to be true even after his present time. But so far we see that there is yet to be a prediction or a prophecy about an event in the distant future about the salvation of a nation. So that is our next key point. The chapter is about Paul's present time. Not that it wouldn't apply to our time, that's my point. He's talking about his present time because the realities that he's talking about are true then and continue to be. He is not making predictions about future events. Oh, but you haven't got to so all Israel will be saved, AK. That's true. We're going to get there. Okay, now notice this. I want you to notice in verse 5 again, it says, in this way then at the present time, a remnant according to God's gracious choice has also come to be. Now, a remnant is a smaller portion of something larger. Of course, we're talking about the remnant of Israel, a remnant of the nation, a remnant of ethnic Israel. Now, we already saw in Romans chapter 9, we talked about it, that a remnant will be saved. So when it comes to ethnic Jews, a remnant, it's not all Jews, it's not a mass of Jews, it's not the nation that's going to be saved, but a remnant. And that remnant consists of believers. Paul was one of them even in his day. The remnant is going to be saved, and they continue to be saved now as they were in Paul's time and all throughout church history, as they will in the future, but it's not an event of the future. You understand? So, notice it says, a remnant according to God's gracious choice has also come to be. Now this word, gracious choice, is the word for election. The Greek word means elect. Okay, now that's important as we follow Paul's train of thought. So a remnant according to God's election has also come to be. Well, that's the elect. That makes the remnant elect. At least from among the ethnic nation, there are an elect people. Those are believers. I want you to remember that. It goes on to say if it's not by, or if it's by grace, which it is no longer of works. The way to get into that is through faith, of course, not through your personal conduct. He had talked about that for the first 5 chapters. Okay. What then? What Israel is seeking, it has not obtained, but the chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. And verse 8, 9, and 10 are quotations from the Old Testament about hardening. Now, verse 7 is also very important and will come up again and again. Let's focus on it. It says, what Israel is seeking, it has not obtained, but the chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. Now notice it's Israel is seeking. It did not obtain it. It's talking about justification. It's talking about righteousness. It's talking about salvation. Israel had not obtained it, but the elect. Now there's the word chosen again. And what we're talking about is two Israels. Now we just saw that the remnant was according to God's election. That's the Greek word. It's the same word right here in verse 7. So, and we know that the remnant was a remnant from Israel. And if you go back to chapter 9, of course, there's an Israel within Israel. So the remnant is the true Israel that the promises meant. The promises to save Israel refer to a true Israel, not the ethnic nation. And right there in verse 7, you got the reoccurrence of two Israels. Now, you might be starting to think, okay, I see where this is going. When Paul says, and so all Israel will be saved. Yes, according to God's promise, but not ethnic Israel. Okay, but anyway, before we get there, let's not get off on that yet. But you see the true Israel right here. Because what you have is the ethnic nation does not obtain it, but the elect from among them, it is the word elect, that is the remnant. Now I want you to just lock that in your mind. The remnant is the elect from Israel. Does it include Gentiles? Well, the elect ultimately does include Gentiles. We're going to see that. We already saw that in Romans 9. But the elect from the nation of Israel is Jews, believing Jews, okay? So you got Israel, and then you got the true Israel within them, and the rest, that's the rest of Israel, were hardened. Now, I want you to remember that, I'm going to bring it back later when it talks about Israel being hardened in part. Part of Israel is hardened, yes, but not the elect. That's the point. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We must proceed here. Okay, verse 11, I say then, did they stumble so as to fall? May it never be, but by their transgression salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them, Israel, jealous. Okay, so did they, Israel, stumble so as to fall? In other words, they stumbled over Christ and fell in large, the nation did. So was the fall, was that the end result? Well, they're gone, no hope for them. The nation that fell, is there any hope? May it never be. Oh, there's hope. But by the Jews' transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them, the Jews, jealous. Now, we are getting into what I am calling the reciprocal effect. What affects one, then affects the other, and then that, in turn, affects again the original. I mean, he says it right there. The Jews' transgression was to persecute Christians, reject the gospel. What you see in the book of Acts, and Paul says it explicitly, that by their rejection, the apostles and evangelists go to the Gentiles, carry the gospel to the Gentiles. The Gentile in groves become saved. But the intended divine effect is to turn and make Jews jealous. What does that mean? Well, he's going to elaborate and we'll talk about it some more. But this is the reciprocal effect. Now, a lot of people refer to my theology as replacement theology. Well, actually, the people that call it that are dispensationalists. And it is a misrepresentation. I don't believe in replacing anything. We'll talk about that later. Or replacing the people. I don't believe in that anyway. There is a replacement of covenants, of course. But anyway, a lot of times what they will say is, so you, AK, and people that think like you throughout church history, you believe, I guess there's no more hope for Israel. And when you see dispensationalists read the question, when they're prepared to start talking about these discussions, friends, these are the kind of things they'll say, is there no more hope for Israel? They'll say, replacement theology says that no hope for Israel. It's all about the church now. They say that all the time. They'll say replacement people, they think they're talking about me and people like me. They'll say, they think that, well, there's no hope for Israel. It's all about Gentiles. It's all about the church. And when they say this, they simply don't know what in the world I believe, or people like me. You see, what we believe, oh, there's hope. And that's exactly the point he's about to make. The fall of the nation is not the end of their hope. Their hope is the gospel. Every individual Jew that hears the gospel can be saved. That's their hope. The hope that Israel has, ethnic Israel, is the gospel. But that's an individual thing. Oh, there's hope, and that's his point. So let's keep reading. Now, because what does he mean to make them jealous? Well, Paul says, now, if their transgressions, same idea, reciprocal, if the Jews' transgression is riches for the world and their failure is riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fullness be? Okay, same idea. But what does it mean, the fullness? We'll come back to that. But I am speaking to you who are Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am an apostle of Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, if somehow I might move to jealousy and save, or move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them. Well, so making them jealous up here and the fullness has something to do with saving the Jews. Okay, that's obvious. But I think the most difficult thing to understand of this section is, what does it mean, the fullness, their fullness mean? Now, dispensationalists believe that the fullness has to refer to the full nation. All of the nation will be saved. He doesn't say that. He's already told us, friends, that only a remnant of the nation is going to be saved. So that's not what that means. Furthermore, whatever the fullness is that he refers to, and I'm going to tell you what it is here in a second, it's not something about the distant future. It's not a prediction about something in the future. Whatever it is, it's obvious that it refers to the saving of some of them. Okay, now, that's what he says. And save some of them. That's what he's talking about. So, the fullness is not a distant thing, because Paul's talking about what he's doing now. So, what it is that say it like this. The salvation of Jews individually throughout any time in history is contributing to the fullness. So even though Paul doesn't explicitly describe what he means by the fullness, here's what's clear. Whatever it is, the saving of Jews in Paul's time was contributing to the fullness. Well, I think the only real good answer is that the fullness is all ethnic Jews being saved throughout history, and history isn't done. But when salvation is done and Christ returns and ready to end all things, the full number of Jewish people that are going to become Christians, that'll be their fullness. Now, there's going to be a fullness of the Gentiles as well, as he's going to talk about. But what is clear is that he's not predicting a future event that he's calling the fullness, because Paul is trying to contribute to it in his time. Because notice that Paul is speaking about individual Jewish salvation, not the salvation of the nation. Notice he says, some of them. Some of them. And as is clear, we have another time indicator. It's not the future. It's not an event of the distant future. What is it? It is something in Paul's present time. Because the realities that Paul is talking about were true in his time. Therefore, they remain true after his time, in our day. So we're not talking about predictions of a future event. We're talking about statements and proclamations of present realities. Okay? So the saving of some Jews contributes to the fullness. It's not talking about all the Jews being saved in the distant future. In fact, that doesn't even mean something, or mean much, friends, because if for 2,000 years and plus, Jews have in large been lost, except for Christians, except for the Jews that become Christians, then what could it really even mean to say, well, all Israel will be saved, if you're referring to the ethnic Jews? Because, well, I suppose if that's what it meant, it would mean all of the Jews, at least at some point in the future, in a particular generation, will be saved. But they've been lost in large for 2,000 plus years, except for those who become Christians. So notice the language that we just saw. Let's look at it again here. Well, let me make sure we're explaining this. So the reciprocal effect. So if you read through the book of Acts, when Paul and them preached to Jews and they were rejected time and time again, eventually they went to the Gentiles. And they said, since you deem yourselves unworthy of eternal life, we're going to the Gentiles and they will listen to it, the gospel. And that's what happened. They persecuted the Christians and the Christians spread out, taking the gospel with them. But once Gentiles came in, the hope of Paul, and evidently is a divine strategy here, is that this, not the nation, but some of them would come to be jealous of the relationship and the greatness that the Gentiles were having as Christians, and that they would lay down their biases and say, all right, I give up. I want some of that. I want what they got. I want this salvation that I should have had in the first place. And, by the way, that same word for jealous could also be translated zealous. I say also, it is translated zealous earlier in chapter 10. They have a zeal for God. If I'm not remembering incorrectly, that's the same Greek word. So it doesn't have to be jealousy. It's this fervor they have is going to be worked up. Well, that's the hope. Okay, so this gets to my current key point. Notice in verse 14, he says, if somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them. Notice the word if, because salvation for Jews, ethnic Jews, is conditional. It's not predicted. What does that mean? Well, think about it. He doesn't say, oh, and they definitely will be saved in the future, the whole nation. No, he says, if somehow I might move to jealousy the Jews and save some of them. Because you see, salvation is not a guarantee of the future for the nation. It is a conditional thing. In other words, it is determined on an individual basis. Individual Jews choose to believe the gospel and come to Christ. There's not a prediction that the nation will come to Christ. But the reason Paul says, I may move some of them and save some of them to jealousy and save some of them, is because you never know which individuals will or will not accept the gospel from among Israel. So Paul has yet to have anything in his mind, he doesn't write it anyway, about some guaranteed salvation of the Jews of the future. He just says, if I might move to salvation, some of them in his time, a present reality, not a future prediction. Okay, verse 15, for if this is still that reciprocal idea, if the rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? Notice that phrase. It'll make sense with the olive tree example here in just a second. Actually, that's where we're going. Verse 16, and if the first piece of dough is holy, well, the lump is also. And if the root is holy, the branches are too. This goes back to the Old Testament law that God had in place. One of the things that God required from the Jews, well, whether it was during their harvest or what it may be, so when they were making their bread and the first lumps that they would make with their dough, they would bring it to God through the priest as an offering. In other words, I'm giving it to you, God, and God would bless it. And if God blesses that first offering, God would bless the rest of their offering. Or they would bring their grain or their harvest, and if God would bless the first by them giving it to Him, then the rest would be blessed as well. Because the first offering came from the same harvest. That first lump came from the same ingredients. And so he's going to be talking about an illustration of an olive tree. And I believe, that makes the most sense, is that the root of the olive tree is the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And that if God accepted and made this covenant with them, the Jews, the Jews came from Abraham. He wasn't a Jew. He was a Hebrew. But if he did it to their fathers, they will be accepted too. Now, he's already told us how. Remember, he said he wants to save some of them, not as a nation, because he didn't see that that was even going to be happening. He didn't say it. Paul saw salvation for ethnic Jews as an individual thing. And so Paul knows that the covenants made with the patriarchs ultimately are fulfilled in Christ and in the gospel. And so God will accept the Jews who come to him. And that's what the olive tree is going to be about. God accepting Jewish believers. Because remember back in the verses, I think, earlier when it said in verse 11, did they stumble so as to fall? What he's saying is, it's not hopeless for Israel. Here's their hope. Not a distant future salvation, but salvation from individual to individual through the gospel. Now, the olive tree is how Paul is going to illustrate this point. Now, some people make this criticism. George Antonios made this in the debate. I've heard other people say it. There's a guy named Dennis. What was his name? Dennis something. I can never remember. But he's a Christian Zionist, and he's on the radio in California. He reaches out to me here and there. He disagrees with me on these things. And anyway, I'm pretty sure he made this point. Maybe I am confusing him with somebody else. But they make this objection. They say, well, wait a minute, AK, this is a moot point for Paul to say. Are you telling me that Paul has to tell people that, yeah, he'll save believers? If a Jew believes, he'll save them. I mean, he's got to make that point. Isn't that obvious? And you think, well, okay, well, I see where they're coming from, AK, and isn't that what you're saying Paul is saying? Well, Paul is saying that Jews who believe can still be saved, sure enough. He's certainly not saying the nation will be saved. But that's his point, is not to say that they will be saved. His point, remember this, you cannot disconnect Romans 9 from, or rather Romans 11 from the first two chapters that come before it. His point is to show how this is how God has kept his promise to Israel. It's not just to say, yeah, God will save believers. No, that's part of the discourse to demonstrate that this is God keeping his promises to Israel in the salvation of Christians. That's the point. That has been his whole point. So no, it's not a moot point because you're not seeing it if you're making that objection. Okay. So, let's go back to this. Okay, now, he said in verse 16, if the first piece of dough is holy, well, the lump is also. If God blessed the first, he'll bless the next. The branches, or rather, and if the root is holy, the branches are too. I believe the branches, he doesn't exactly tell us, right? But I think the idea is the root of the olive tree is the patriarchs, maybe just Abraham. Some people say it's Jesus. That's not unreasonable, but I think the idea is it is Abraham and the patriarchs. Now, if the root was accepted, if they were God's people, Abraham, Isaac, the patriarchs, well, then any branch connected to them is going to be too. But now, if already you're saying, yes, and the Jews are connected, AK, well, you just missed everything he said. It's not the ethnic people that are going to be saved, but believers. It's not the ethnic nation of Israel that's his people, but believers. And the olive tree is going to show that by showing that the unbelieving branches are taken out of the tree and Gentile branches are put into it. So it's not an ethnic connection. It's really beautiful. Because what you have to remember is the olive tree is not some new thing he's changing subjects on. It's to illustrate everything that he has said. But using the olive tree example, if you go back to Jeremiah 11, the olive tree is Israel. In the Old Testament, not just Jeremiah 11, but that particularly is where Paul is getting his idea. That's where he gets the illustration. He didn't just make it up on the spot here. He got the illustration of the olive tree from the Old Testament, and in the Old Testament scriptures, in their history, Israel is the olive tree. Because you see, what have we been saying? What has Paul been talking about since Romans 9? He's been talking about how there are two Israels. There's an Israel within Israel. And especially once you connect it to Galatians 3 and 4, you see that this does include Gentiles, even though the focus is on Jewish people from Israel, Jewish believers from Israel. And what Paul says is that this is Christians now. This is the olive tree now. In other words, believers now are the olive tree. They are that true Israel that was truly the recipients of the promises to Israel. He says in verse 17, but if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, he's talking to Gentile Christians. So we were an olive tree, but we're not that olive tree. We're not the natural one. If you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them and become a partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches, but if you do boast against them, remember, it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. So this is to protect against arrogance and any condescending attitude Gentile Christians may have to the Jews. It could be easy, especially in their time, Gentile Christians to say, listen, you Jews had your chance, you ruined it. You blew it, man, you Jewish people. So now he's done with you. Now we Gentiles, now we're getting our time. And Paul's saying, but listen, by you being saved, there's still hope for Jews to be moved to jealousy, to be saved, some of them, not the nation in the future, but some of them at any given time. And you don't need to be high-minded, because you can be cast out of that olive tree just like the Jews were. And that's what he's about to say. Do not boast, Gentile Christians, because just as they were cast out, so can you. But remember, while he's making that point about high-mindedness, he's telling them what he's been saying already, we've been listening to it, is that they still have just as much hope as you. They just got to believe the gospel. But notice, some of the branches, he says, if some of the branches were broken off. Now, what are some of the branches? Well, it's quite obvious, because what was he talking about? Remember, the olive tree is illustrating what he's already talking about, and what he was talking about is the attempt he has in his evangelism and in his ministry to save some Jews. Now, Paul would like, just like me, he would like to save all Jews, but it is evident that Paul didn't think that was going to happen. The best he could do is save some of them. So when he talks about some of the branches, he's obviously talking about Jews who were once the covenant people, but Christ came along and made a new covenant with Israel. That's the olive tree. And those unbelieving individuals were taken out of the covenant. Your ethnicity is not going to cut it. And those Gentile branches that put their faith in Christ are added to the olive tree. You know what that means? That means Gentile Christians are added to Israel because it is a true Israel. But the point I'm making at the moment is the branches are individuals. People like to come up with these things like, no, these are nations. They're not nations. These are individuals. That's the whole line of thought. Now, the dispensationalist I debated, George Antonios, he was all over the map. He said, well, some of the branches are nations, some of them are individuals, and some of them are tribes. He said, well, nations are made up of individuals, don't you know? Well, yeah, but if some of the branches you say are individuals, then all of the branches together would make a nation, one nation. But it's inconsistent. Some of the branches are nations, some of them are people, some of them are tribes. See, that's just trying to make sense of a theology that Paul does not share. It's obvious that the branches are Jewish individuals, and that wild branches that come from the wild olive tree, there's only two. There's one olive tree that is wild, and that's all people that are not Jewish. And then there's the natural olive tree, which was the covenant people of God. Unbelieving Jews are taken out. Paul was saying that he and his ministry wanted to make as many jealous, to move them to give up their problems with Christianity, just accept it for the truth that it is and become Christian and be added back to the tree. Now he goes on to say, and well, there's my arrow illustrating that, but he goes on to say, you will say them branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Quite right. They were broken off for their unbelief. That's an individual thing. Nations don't come in and out of faith. But you stand by your faith, do not be haughty, but fear, for God did not spare the natural branches. He will not spare you either. Behold then the kindness and severity of God. To those who fell, severity, but to you, God's kindness, if you continue in His kindness, otherwise you will be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. He's illustrating the point he had been making, that their hope is not lost. They didn't fall, or they didn't stumble just to fall. That their hope is that some of them, individuals from Israel, will still be saved. And in which case they will be added by faith back into that covenant Israel that they were originally part of. But notice it says once again, if they do not continue. This goes back to a key point that I already made. Salvation for Jews is conditional. It's not predicted. In other words, once again, we do not have Paul saying, well, oh, they will be saved, especially in the future. No, it's if, because it's an individual by individual thing. And as you saw there, the next key point, and this is super important, Gentile Christians are in God's Israel. We just saw that with the olive tree, because the church is spiritual Israel. It is the true Israel. It's not defined by ethnicity, not God's Israel of promise. Now that's the phraseology I prefer. I say it all the time. There's an Israel, and then there's an Israel of promise, and it is the church. It is believers that are the Israel of promise. Gentile, most of the time throughout the New Testament, now think about this. Most of the time in the New Testament, when it is talking about God's people, or when it's talking about people being saved and added to a community of believers, most of the time it describes it in terms of non-Jews being added to a Jewish people. Ephesians 2, all of the book of Galatians, and other places. Because Gentiles become added to a true and spiritual Israel of promise. Not that Jews become added to some new body of people. And then there's another point that we'll get from the olive tree, which is absolutely important, maybe the most important of all when it comes to our subject. Now, what is it? Well, friends, the truth is there is only one olive tree. Therefore, there is only one people of God. But popular theology says there are two distinct peoples of God. There is Israel, and then there's also the church. No, there's only one olive tree. You see, if popular theology was correct, we should see in the text that God took this original olive tree that He had with Israel, He uprooted the whole thing. He planted a new tree that was a Gentile tree, a Gentile olive tree, that's the wild one. And He took branches out of the natural tree and planted it into this new tree. And then at some point, God is going to replant that original olive tree, Israel, and so then He'll have two olive trees. But that's not what you find. No, God takes Gentiles and adds them to the one olive tree that He already had. That's what you have to understand. I want you to marinate on that. God is using, or the illustration is of an olive tree that God already had. Well, what was that? That was Israel. And He takes out of it the branches that do not believe, and He takes Gentile branches that come to believe, and He puts those in it. But that's not popular theology. In popular theology, you need for him to uproot the original olive tree, take Jewish branches that believe and put it into that olive tree, and then there's a replanting of another olive tree. But friends, it's just not there because that doesn't exist. All of that stuff that makes up popular theology is wrong. And now we get into the most debated portion of the chapter. Now, we've already gone through the majority of the chapter. We have yet to see that supposed prediction of a mass salvation of the nation of Israel in the future. All Paul has been talking about is present realities, not distant future promises. Oh, but okay, well, it doesn't matter because you have it right here at the end. Well, okay. I'm going to show you, though, that that doesn't work. When you read these verses along with Paul's whole discourse. Paul says in verse 25, "For I do not want you, brothers, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation that a partial hardening has happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. Just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, and he will remove ungodliness from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins." Okay. And so what do we have here? When he says, "I do not want you to be uninformed," and he says that you will be not wise in your own estimation, because remember what he had been saying is the hope of Israel is not lost. So Gentile Christians don't need to think about that. That was especially something they would think about in those days. The hope of Israel is Christ. Not a future salvation, but Christ. At any given time, individual Jews can be added back to that olive tree. That's all that he's been saying. And the ultimate point is that this is how, by the formation of this one, that's two, I guess if I hold up two fingers, this one olive tree is how God fulfills his promise to save Israel. So you remember he's been talking about two Israels. And so when he says, "For I do not want you to be uninformed," listen, that word "for" is pointing back. Because this is something Paul is concluding from everything that he's been saying. I mean, we are at the end of 3 chapters worth of something he's been talking about. So he's getting into conclusions. He's getting into wrapping things up. So when he says "for," this refers back immediately to the olive tree illustration and everything else that Paul has said. And the olive tree was just illustrating what Paul had said. So whatever we're about to read has to be saying something about what he has said. Now, right there, we have a problem for modern theology because he hasn't said anything about a future restoration of the nation of Israel. So if what he's about to say is just commenting all that, we should expect that he had said something about that if what we read is, as most people think today, a promise of a mass salvation of Israel in the future. But it isn't. He says, "For I do not want you to be uninformed of this mystery." Now, you know, in the New Testament, you know what a mystery is? A mystery is truth that was a revelation that was unknown and then brought to light in the New Testament era. You see the word used in the Gospels. You see Paul use it in 1 Corinthians 2. It's revelation that nobody knew, but now is being revealed. It's not a mystery anymore. So Paul is telling us something that had previously not been known. Okay? And it is these things that he has been saying. He says that here's where let's look at this first before we look at verse 26. that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Well, of course, this is exactly what he's been talking about, right? Because he's already been talking about the hardening. He talked about it in chapter 9. We read him talking about it in Romans 11. Now, here's what popular theology says. That all of a sudden, he starts talking about something he hasn't said yet. Okay, which is what? They think that he's saying, well, there's a partial hardening until the fullness of the Gentiles. And then when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, then that hardening is going to be lifted. And then Israel will come out of blindness, and then all of the nation will be saved. I think everybody recognizes that's what they say. In other words, the hardening is temporary, that whenever this marker of the fullness of Gentiles is complete, at that point, the hardening is lifted, and then the rest of the nation that was hardened becomes saved, and so all Israel will be saved. Okay, that's not what he's saying. First, you already know, because we went through the whole chapter, based upon what was already said in chapter 9 and 10, that he hadn't said anything like that. First, a partial hardening does not mean a temporary hardening. That's what people will say. Their hardening is temporary, as if that's what he means. He doesn't say it's a temporary hardening. He says it's a partial hardening. What is a partial hardening? We've already seen it. Remember, Paul's already been talking about this, and that was in verse 7. What did verse 7 say? What then, what Israel is seeking, that's the nation of Israel, it has not obtained, but the chosen, the elect, that's the Greek word, the elect obtained it. And who was the elect? We saw that was the remnant. And the rest were hardened. The rest. In other words, some Jewish people from the nation, from ethnic Israel, are not hardened. Well, if the whole thing is not hardened, then what do you have? You have a partial hardening. So it's not a temporary hardening. That's not what he's saying it is. He's saying not all of Israel, the nation, is hardened, only part of them. The part that is not hardened, we've already saw. I keep saying that. It's bad grammar. We've already seen that the elect from among Israel is not. And the rest, in other words, part of the nation is hardened. So when Paul's talking about a partial hardening, he does not mean a temporary hardening. He means not every Jewish person has been hardened. The elect, believers, Christians who are Jewish are not hardened. That's what he means. Okay. But then he says, in other words, we'll say it like this, part of the nation of Israel has been hardened until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Now, what is the fullness of the Gentiles? Well, again, he doesn't explain it, but if the fullness of the Jews means all the Jewish people that are going to be saved ultimately, and Paul's saving of some of them contributes to that, just like I believe that as we evangelize Jewish people and save Jewish people who become Christian and saved, is contributing to the fullness of the Jews. And then all Gentile Christians throughout history that ultimately become saved are the fullness of the Gentiles. And if you have the fullness of the Gentiles and you have the fullness of the Jews, but remember they're all part of the same olive tree, so in other words, the olive tree eventually is going to be complete. And then you will have salvation complete. Now I want you to think about this. When it says, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, if you think, there's two problems that people have, dispensationalists who read this verse. Well, there's, I guess, more than that, but two that I'm going to comment on at this point. Number one, they think that the fullness of the Gentiles must refer to some event that happens sometime in history, and that history continues on afterwards. Maybe the destruction of Jerusalem or something like that. And then, as a follow-up, they say, and then at that point, there will be a lifting of the hardening. Here's the problem. It does not say, number one, that the hardening is going to be lifted. Now, everybody reads that into the idea. And I understand it, right? If I say that the grass is going to be dry until it rains, well, it makes sense that you think, and then it will no longer be dry. But here's the thing. The reason you know the grass, how am I going to explain this? I want to explain this without taking too much time or being too complicated. It's actually a pretty simple thing. I'll say it like this. The word until, U-N-T-I-L, does not imply, I repeat, it does not imply that whatever was occurring is then going to change. Think about that. It does not actually tell you that necessarily what was happening is going to stop or reverse or change. Now, there's other things in the sentence that will tell you that. So, for example, how about this? In the book of Acts, Paul is giving a speech before he's in court, and he says, "Brethren, I have lived in all good conscience until this day." It's in the book of Acts. Actually, there's a lot of verses that use this word in this way. And what Paul does not mean is that, well, now he no longer has a good conscience. After today, no more of a good conscience. Jesus said, "I am with you until the end." Does that mean he will then no longer be with us or with them? No, of course not. You see, until doesn't tell you whether what was already occurring is going to change or stop. If I say something is happening until something else, that first thing that was happening may or may not change. I just gave you a couple of examples that prove just that. Now, the only thing that could tell you that that is so is other factors beside the word until. For example, when I said earlier that the grass will be dry until it rains, well, the reason you know that the grass will then no longer be dry is because you know that when it rains, it gets wet. But it is not the word until that told you that. It was the other information in the sentence. I'll just repeat it. When Paul says, "I have lived in all good conscience until this day," he's not saying he will no longer. He will continue to have a good conscience. When Jesus said, "I am with you until the end," he will then continue to be with them even after the end. So you cannot see the word until and then think, okay, then whatever was happening is going to change. That is not the case. So when it says that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles, that does not mean, and then the hardening will no longer be there. That's not what he's saying. Paul does not commenting on, he's not saying the hardening will be lifted. He isn't talking about that. And this is especially true that the fullness of the Gentiles, the best explanation of that phrase, it means all the Gentiles throughout history that will ultimately become saved. The full number. Well, there is no more salvation of anybody after that. So there's not like, then more Jews will be saved. No, now I gotta talk about this. It says, now you may say, and I'm not going to get too technical into this because it won't matter ultimately, but let me just explain this. Some people will say, "Oh, AK, you're missing something here in the grammar." And I got you. It's not just the word until. You say, No, it's the aorist and the subjective nature of this. It's a subjunctive. I'm not going to get into this too much, but it's the grammar and the mood and the tense and all that. It's not just the word until, it's all the rest of the grammar. Every other time you see this in the scriptures, it means that whatever was happening suddenly is not going to be there anymore. Well, let me tell you this, friends. Unless you think that the fullness of the Gentiles is an event that happens within history instead of at the end, well, you might have to figure out what that means then. But I see no reason to believe that the fullness of the Gentiles is not all of the Gentiles who were saved until the end of history. But this is what I know, to keep this simple. What Paul is not elaborating on is the lifting of the hardening. So even if you want to say, well, the hardening happens until the fullness of the Gentiles, and then it will be no longer. Well, I ultimately do believe that is the case, because when history is complete and you have the full number of Gentiles who are saved, you're not going to have any more hardening, because you're not going to have anybody left who harden, because when Christ returns, salvation will be complete, and he will destroy all of his enemies permanently and for eternity. But ultimately, here's the issue. Paul has already been talking about these things. So if you want to start saying, well, the hardening is going to be lifted and then more Jews will be saved, you are saying, number one, you are saying something that Paul actually doesn't say there. You only infer it, but it doesn't mean he says it. And number two, Paul never actually said that anywhere before. And since here is just something he's concluding or summarizing from what he's already been talking about, there isn't any good evidence or reason to believe those things. In fact, they cannot be true, because Paul has already told us that it's not the ethnic people that is God's people, it's the believing Jews and Gentiles. Those are how Paul defines his people. It's only a remnant of Jews that are going to be saved, not the entire nation. And Paul isn't making anywhere else a prediction about the future. He's been talking about present realities. Now, when I say that when salvation is complete, now that obviously happens in the future. But if you understand what I'm saying, my point is that Paul is not making a prediction about an event of the future. He's talking about present realities that will be true in the future, but they were true in his day, and they are true in our day. The salvation of individual Jews is always happening. The salvation of Gentiles is happening. And in the future, once all of those things that have been true are complete, salvation is complete, that one olive tree is done, and eternity, and the new heavens, new earth is ushered in, all that good stuff. But now verse 26, and when he says, and so all Israel will be saved, you have to understand that Paul has already been trying to tell you there is a true Israel. He's been talking about two Israels. Not all of Israel is Israel. He already told us that. And he's been making it clear that there are two, that there's a real Israel, an Israel of promise, and this is the conclusion from everything he's been saying, and he's saying, if you go back to chapter 9, what did we start with? I told you that all of these chapters is Paul explaining how God's promises to save Israel has been kept despite the fact that the nation of Israel was lost. And Paul has been saying because there is a true Israel and it's not the nation of Israel. And this is the conclusion. He's saying, oh, God's promises are true. All Israel will be saved. It's that true Israel. Now, I know some people might be asking. Someone might be saying, in fact, I listened to a man named Mike Winger. He asked this question. He said, now, those of you who believe this kind of thing that I'm talking about, he says, are you trying to tell me that in verse 25, Israel means one thing, the ethnic nation, but then all of a sudden, in the next verse, it means something different? Now, AK, You just said in verse 25 that a partial hardening has happened to Israel, and you acknowledge that that is the ethnic nation. And you're telling me that the very next verse, it's a different Israel? And I'm thinking to myself, Mike, do you not remember Romans chapter 9, verse 6, when Israel meant two different things in one statement? In chapter 9, verse 6, Israel had two meanings, and it occurred almost in the same sentence. Most certainly in the same verse. And it is in the same sentence. Not all who descended from Israel are Israel. And so you're looking at me like you're just baffled that Israel can mean two different things in two different verses when it means two different things in one verse. And this whole idea that, well, no, this just means a true Jew, but you still have to be an ethnic Jew, is blown out of the water by what Paul says right after that in Romans 9, when he says it's not the children of the flesh. And if you go to Galatians 3 and 4, I already showed you that the same language, the same ideas, counted as seed, children of promise, is applied to Gentile Christians. Besides the fact that it was in chapter 9 that Paul went on to say that Gentiles were a part of, quote unquote, my people. Of course, Israel here means spiritual Israel, because he's been talking about two Israels through the whole thing. Making the point that there was one that was lost, one to whom the promises did not apply, and one to whom it did. And he just confirms that in the next few verses. He says, or the next statements, just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. That's Christ. Of course, he did come from Zion. Didn't that happen the first time? Of course it did. Jesus already came. He did remove ungodliness from Jacob. He did that in two ways. Remember, Jacob refers to Israel. But what Christ did is he came to Israel and he saved, through his teaching and covenant, the remnant of Israel, and the rest are no longer a part of God's people. He did remove ungodliness because he took to himself a people that consisted only of believers, and through his atonement, that's the next verse, verse 27, he washed them all clean, the remnant. And thus all you're left with is a justified, righteous people of Israel. The rest are out. Now, when you say he will remove ungodliness from Jacob, you have to realize he just demonstrated that by his illustration of the olive tree. In the illustration of the olive tree, remember that the unbelieving branches are taken out. Ungodliness has been removed. Did you know that we see this all throughout the New Testament? And that this happened back then at his first coming. This isn't something that's happening in the future. This is something that has already been happening. You remember John chapter 1? Talking about Jesus in verse 11 of John chapter 1, it says, he, Jesus, came to what was his own, that's his people, the nation of Israel, and those who were his own did not receive him. That's the Jews in large, right? And then it says, but remember, now look, in one statement it says that they did belong to him, but then those who belonged to him, that's the covenant people, at that time it was the nation of Israel, they did not receive him. His own people did not receive him. But then it says in verse 12, but as many as received him, that's the remnant, because if it's not all of them, then it has to be a smaller number of them, right? But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God. Isn't that just what it told us in Romans 9? It's the children of promise that are counted as seed, not the children of the flesh, but also happens to be what Galatians 3 and 4 tells us about Gentile Christians. Isn't that beautiful? And it dismantles popular theology, dispensationalism. Even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. See, the rest, they were his own, but then as the new covenant was established, they no longer were. Those branches were taken out. He is removing ungodliness. And not only that way, but by the reformation of sinners who come into Christianity, He's reforming people. But so now, if we go back to Romans 11 here, the point is this. Well, let me say this. Verse 27 again, and this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. That's the new covenant. A lot of people believe the new covenant for Israel is still future. No, it's not. He already made the new covenant in the upper room, in the Lord's Supper, as we call it. He had Jews there. All of those people that were there with him were Jews. They were a part of Israel, and he establishes a new covenant. He says, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Paul the Apostle in 2 Corinthians chapter, I think it's 3, says that he is a minister of the new covenant. The new covenant is already in effect, and it starts with Israel. And just as the olive tree illustrates, Gentiles who believe are added to that group, not the other way around. So this is my covenant when I take away their sins. Everybody is aware that the new covenant is a covenant in which the forgiveness of sins is realized, specialized, and emphasized. And so when it says in verse 26, so all Israel will be saved, not only is he already concluding what he has already been saying, he's been talking about the salvation of individual Jews, but when he goes on to say, just as it is written, and then talks about things that apply to things that had already occurred, we realize that the salvation of Israel, even though it's not complete, is already in progress. He's not saying at some point in the distant future, all the nation that happens to be in that generation will be saved. No, he's saying all of God's true Israel will be saved. It's already happening. I'm already contributing to it now in my ministry. I'm saving Jews, and you know what? Even to this very day, we're doing the same thing. That's how Israel is going to be saved, by the New Covenant church, which all throughout the New Testament is described as Israel in a variety of different ways. It is an Israel of promise, not one that consists of ethnicity. Okay. Verse 28, and we're almost done here, but from the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but from the standpoint of God's choice, they are blood for the sake of the fathers. Okay, someone says the removing of ungodliness from Jacob means sending the Romans to slay the wicked in 70 AD. I don't believe that's the case. I know some people say that, and here's why. Because Paul, when he talks about it, he uses things that have already occurred. The new covenant has already been established. He's already been talking about the olive tree example. So the idea that it's going to be the 70 AD in the future, he just simply does not say. And anyway, the things that he does say, as I just demonstrated, are applying to realities that were already in effect. Actually, those statements about a deliverer will come, those Christ had come, had established a new covenant, had already began that work. And here's the other thing. It doesn't really make sense with the 70 AD. Because in 70 AD, he did not remove ungodliness from Jacob. He destroyed all of ungodliness, and the true Israel had already been there and did not have those people in it to be gotten rid of. Now see, the AD 70 thing, when the Romans came and destroyed the natural nation, it would make more sense if it was applying, or if this verse meant that, if that was still his people, and then the unrighteous among them were destroyed, and then you had righteous Jews left, and they still continued to be his people. But that's not what happened. All those who were destroyed were already unbelieving people. They weren't removed from Jacob. They weren't even a part of it at the time. Okay, but let's go on. So verse 28, from the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but from the standpoint of God's election, God's choice, same word, election, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Okay, verse 28. Now, once again, my friends who are dispensationalists, here's what they say this means. That yes, when it comes to Christianity, yeah, the Jews oppose Christianity and they persecute it and they reject the gospel, but God still loves them because of their fathers. In other words, these unbelieving Jewish people, the nation of Israel, it's in unbelief, it's in rebellion against God, and yeah, they're enemies of the gospel, but you know what? God still loves them. That's not what Paul is saying. I mean, and that's not what Paul is saying. Because he hadn't said that. Now, it is true God loves them, but God loves everybody. I mean, he loves Gentiles who are in rebellion against him. And the reason God loves, here's the thing, the reason God loves unbelieving Jews is not because of their fathers, it's because they are human beings made in his image. Now, think about it. Does God love unbelieving Gentiles? I think everybody recognizes that even lost people who are Gentiles are loved by God. Now, the question is, why does he love them? Is it because of their fathers? Well, that doesn't make any sense. No, there's no information where we can conclude that. He loves the lost people from the Gentiles because they're human beings, because he loves his own creation, because he loves people who are made in his image. So it would be inconsistent. Well, you see, the reason he loves the Jews who are in rebellion is because of their ancestors. That's it. He loves them because of their ancestors. Well, if all of the Gentile ancestors were wicked, wouldn't that mean he would hate us because of our wicked ancestors? See, that's not what the text is saying. Actually, he's already said this. This is why it is important to know everything Paul has said. Paul had already said the statement. He just said it a little bit differently. Because remember that the words for God's choice here is just the word election. Well, what is this but verse 7? Remember back in verse 7, he said, what Israel is seeking, it has not obtained, but the elect obtained it. The elect is the remnant. The remnant is the saved from among Israel. So in verse 7, once again, as you had throughout all three chapters, you had the nation at large who was unbelieving, but then you had believers from them who are called the elect. So in verse 28, that's exactly the same distinction. He says, from the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies, meaning Israel in general. Yes, they are persecutors of Christianity. They persecuted Christians. They were the biggest persecutors in the beginning. They killed the Christians. They rejected the gospel. It says all this throughout the letters of Paul. So from the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But from the standpoint of the elect, the remnant is what that is. The elect of God is the remnant. That's the believers from Israel. They are beloved for the sake of the fathers. In other words, when God made his covenant with Abraham and Isaac, he made these covenants that we partake of. They are beloved. They partake of God's love because God is fulfilling and keeping his promises to the patriarchs. Friends, it comes full circle. That's exactly what we've already said is the point of all three chapters. Paul is in these three chapters telling us how God has kept his promises to Israel, and they're not broken just because the nation of Israel is lost. But the promises he made to Israel were the promises rooted in the promises he made to the fathers. He's keeping his promises, thus for the sake of the fathers. Therefore, the elect, the one that isn't hardened, is beloved. The reason they share in God's love is because we come into Christ, we come into the new covenant. This is the covenant that is fulfilling the promises made not just to Israel, but ultimately to the patriarchs. Now, but yet, people still are going to say these kinds of things. They're going to say, now, wait a minute, AK, how can you make this distinction between the they there and the they later? So if it says they are enemies for your sake, and then they are beloved, you're saying that makes two different peoples? Number one, the whole point of these three chapters is to show these two different peoples. I think I said three, I meant two. You have Israel of the flesh and you have the Israel of promise. He's been saying it the whole time. Number two, you have to realize that the word for they and the word for they here is actually not in the Greek. It is supplied in English, but there is no they. That's just the way the Greek works. It says, from the standpoint of the gospel, enemies for your sake, but from the standpoint of the elect, beloved for the sake of the fathers. So we have to make that make sense in English. But number three, since Paul has already told us this, he already made this statement earlier in a different way, we know what he's talking about because he's saying the same thing. He's saying there's an Israel of the flesh that is the enemies, but those from among ethnic Israel that become Christians, they, in fulfillment of the promises made to the fathers, are beloved. And then he says, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. In other words, those original promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are being fulfilled. Not some distant future salvation, but it already is happening now. But this is what people who are dispensationalists will often say to me, in general. When they realize that we say that the promises made to Israel are fulfilled in Christ and are fulfilled in the church, they'll say, oh, so God just breaks His promises? And they'll say, now I, a dispensationalist, I believe God keeps His promises. And they like to represent people who believe like I do as if God does not keep His promises. But no, it's not what we believe. The whole 3-chapter discourse is about God keeping His promise through the remnant of Israel being saved along with the Gentiles, the one olive tree. That's the church. It is the Israel of promise. That is the Israel that will be saved. That's what always was meant, because it's not the people of the flesh. Yeah, someone says the promises was that Abraham would become the father of many nations. Absolutely. Which in Galatians 3 and chapter 4 and all throughout Galatians tells us includes the Gentiles who believe. Absolutely. We are, I don't think, did I even read that part? I might have, or I may have forgotten. But let me go back to Galatians 3 because the very end of it says exactly that, or what we're talking about. And so in Galatians 3 and verse 29, it says, if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed. I think I did read it, and heirs according to promise. That's the whole point. This is the fulfillment that He will be the father of many nations. So, no, actually, so let me say it like this. You got two ways. Okay, I want everybody to think about this. This is an important point. You have this one thing that Paul is trying to demonstrate in these 3 chapters. He's trying to demonstrate how God has kept His promises, despite the fact that the nation of Israel is in unbelief, as it still is today. Now you got 2 answers on how Paul sees this. You have what I have explained and what Christians have been saying for 2,000 years, that Paul has kept his promises through the salvation of a remnant along with believing Gentiles in what constitute a spiritual Israel, and called that throughout the New Testament. And then you've got dispensationalism's answer, which is what? It's that, oh, God will keep His promises in the future. For now He has cast them off, but He will keep His promise in the future and save all of some generation of Jews. Never mind the 2,000 years of them that have been lost, but some generation in the distant future, at least distant from Paul's perspective, He will save some generation of Jews, and then all Israel will be saved, and then God will have kept His promise. Which one matches the text? When Paul is talking about his present truth realities and not the distant future, and Paul has already said, no, it's a remnant of Israel that will be saved, not the nation, that it is not the whole ethnic nation that is the Israel intended by the promises, Romans 9:6. Which one matches what Paul actually says? It's not the dispensationalist answer. That is read into the text. And we're not even done. Now we're almost done. So in verse 30 it says, for just as you once were disobedient to God, but now have been shown mercy because of their disobedience, so these also now have been disobedient, that because of the mercy shown to you, they also may now be shown mercy. You know what this is? What we're talking about in verse 30 and 31, this is that reciprocal effect. Remember earlier, Paul was talking about how by their transgression, in verse 11, 12, and onward, he said, by the Jews' transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them, the Jews, jealous. It's a reciprocal effect. And ended in, or the ultimate result was the salvation of individual Jews, as it still continues to do this day. So this is that same idea. You were disobedient once. Now you have mercy because of the Jews' disobedience. So these, the Jews, now have been disobedient, that because of the mercy shown to you, now you receive salvation. They also may now receive mercy by being moved to jealousy. They want what the Gentiles have, and they come and put their faith in Christ. Now, you notice that what we have here are time markers. Paul is talking about present realities. Look at what he says. Verse 30, but just as you once were disobedient to God, but now have been shown mercy, present reality, present time, because of their disobedience. Verse 31, so these also now have been disobedient, that because of the mercy shown to you, they may now be shown mercy. Not the distant future, not that because of the mercy shown to you Gentiles, they will in the distant future receive mercy by the restoration of their nation. No, he's talking about salvation that is happening to them now. It's not the nation. Because Paul has already said, it is a remnant of Israel that will be saved, not the nation. He doesn't say it's the nation. Now, not a prediction about the future. Now, I got to say this. This last now actually doesn't appear in all manuscripts. And I'm not going to get into that whole discussion, but I do believe this is the proper reading. But if you read the King James, it won't have that very last now. And that's okay, because it's still obvious that that is the point. So I'll just cover up that now. You still have the other nows. You still have Paul talking about present time all throughout the chapter. It's very clear that this is not about the future. It's about present realities that, yes, continue on into the present day and will be in the future. Jews can always be saved as long as the gospel is going out. Now, so it's all been fascinating, and what I want to do, so I've reached the conclusion, and I'm telling you, there isn't a single leg that dispensational has on this chapter. So I want to summarize by going through our key points. What we have is that there are two Israels in Romans 9, 10, and 11. We see, especially in Romans 9, before we ever get to Romans 11, that believing Jews and Gentiles are defined explicitly as God's people, not the nation of Israel. It never says that. We see that Paul tells us it's a remnant of Israel that will be saved. He doesn't say the nation will be saved. It is quite obvious that God has not now, in Paul's time, rejected his people. He says it. He gives himself as an example. Contrary to modern theology saying, well, God has, but it ain't going to be forever. We saw that Romans 11 is talking about present realities in Paul's time. There is no prediction about events isolated in the future related to Israel. We saw that when it referred to salvation for Jews, it was conditioned upon individuals accepting it. There was no prediction as of, oh, it will happen, and to all of them, you don't have that. Gentile Christians, this is probably the most two important points. Gentile Christians are in God's Israel via the olive tree example. And there is only one olive tree, meaning one people of God. Modern theology says there's two distinct people of God. In fact, you hear them say it. I hear Jack Hibbs, a popular dispensational teacher, all the time saying, God's people is Israel and we are not them. No, there's only one olive tree. It includes believing Jews, believing Gentiles. There's never a mention of a second one that belongs to God at all. All right, well, we've reached the end of this. We got to 2 hours. And if you I think it would be helpful even if you went to that video on my channel that is called Romans 11 in 20 minutes, that would kind of put a cap. It would take what I've said in 2 hours and condense it, probably help to summarize everything I've said. So anyway, there's just no room for this thinking that is popular. But, it's up to you. You make your own decisions. You don't have to agree with me. I don't know how you would. But anyway. All right, so we've reached the close of this. You got any last questions or comments that I can kind of address as we bring this to close? Put in the comments at AK, so I don't just have to look at everything that has popped up. Let me say this and remind everybody that this podcast is available on various podcast platforms. You get Spotify, iHeartRadio, and others. So just look it up. Most people, I believe, use Spotify. And if that is where you listen to this, then you can catch this live when we do go live. We don't always go live, but when we do, you can catch it. You can be notified anyway. Just subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/AK Richardson, or you can just search up my name. You could look me up on Twitter. It's AK Richardson 2. And I want to remind you that I do receive invitations to speak and give lectures and do Q&A on different topics, different places. So you could email me at AK Richardson, or I'm sorry, it's AK Richardson, one word, at Zoho.com. Z as in zebra, ZOHO.com. AK Richardson at Zoho.com. I'm going to tell you, if you email me, keep it short. If I receive like any more than like a few sentences, I'm just simply not going to have the time to read it. So keep it short, keep it pithy, keep it to the point. And you have a better chance of me seeing your email. I get so much stuff. So anyway, all right, everybody, let's see what we got. Someone said, great job. I left 15 years of dispensationalism 15 years ago. Get my book. You'll love it. Okay. Wrote a book. That's interesting. You may have told me that before. I can't remember who's who, all the time. But I appreciate you being on the side chat. Appreciate you listening. All right, I'm not getting any more, so we're going to bring this to a close. You don't have to agree, but I just hope that you will consider. I hope that you will pray about it. Continue to study. If nothing else, just keep studying the issue. Pray for this channel and the material I put out there. Just pray that it's successful. Pray that I may continue in God's will. I'm thankful to God that He gives me these opportunities. All right, everybody. God bless you. I am out.